The kitchen is one of those zones that you're definitely going to be spending a lot of time in there, especially around mid-game or late game, and it's definitely one of those areas that trip up a lot of newer players once they finally hit a high enough level to start using all the equipment you can find there. But since there's just so many different mechanics, tools, and items to engage with, for this video I'm just going to focus on one super important piece of equipment. And it's usually one of the first things players can unlock here, and that's the sink. Now, despite the fact that the kitchen is primarily used for crafting food that you'll use to refill your hunger or they can use to get certain buffs, when it comes to the sink, this equipment is actually quite limited in terms of what it can do for food preparation. Now, that's not to say it's not useful. It's actually pretty vital for any recipe that uses pasta or anything else that requires you to remove liquid from solid items using a strainer. But in reality, the main two purposes of the sink is that it's supposed to be an easily accessible water source for your base, which in turn also makes it one of the best pieces of equipment for cleaning all the various tools used during cooking phases, as well as cleaning the dishware that you actually use to hold the food while eating or storing it. Now, if you're a speedrunner, you can sometimes get away with not cleaning your dishes to save time on your splits, depending on what goal you're currently speedrunning towards, but depending on the skip, this does carry an inherent risk of giving your character a sickness debuff, which can actually waste a lot more time during a run, and depending on the severity of the debuff, can actually cut the run short, forcing you to reset. So for most players, cleaning these types of items actually becomes one of the most consistent and necessary parts of the gameplay loop. So, let me walk you through some of the most important things to consider in optimizing your sink gameplay so that you can cut down on your overall washing time while still producing consistent results in the quality of your washes. Alright, so first things first, let's talk about upgrades. And to be honest, there are really only 3 categories of sink upgrades, with the most important category being basin upgrades, followed by faucet, and then last but not least there's utility, which basically includes all of the minor stuff that's convenient to have and that can definitely save you some time, but that don't really affect the way you approach gameplay. So to be honest, I won't really be talking about these too much. But anyways, when it comes to basin upgrades, you're most likely going to want to make sure you're spec'd into dual basins. Single basin sinks can get the job done, but they mostly do well in other zones like bathrooms, where the sink doesn't really need to fill that many roles. And since kitchens use sinks for multiple different purposes, dual basin is almost always the way to go. Now, if you're a solo, or generally just a more advanced player, you may want to consider the mega basin route instead, because they're actually super useful for cleaning larger tools like baking sheets and stock pots. However, you do lose out on some of the more convenient perks of dual basins, which is that they're actually incredibly well suited to multitasking gameplay. And this type of approach is most commonly used to soak crustier dishes in one basin while leaving the other one free for standard washing or anything else you may need. However, this is actually less of an issue for most advanced players since they'll typically wash things right away to prevent crust buildup, or if they don't have the time to clean right away, usually because they've aligned themselves with an outside organization that requires them to leave their base for pre-scheduled time-gated events, they'll usually either take the time to at least rinse their dishes to remove any excess traces of food, or they'll use the time where they're away from base to let these items soak in the basin if they really need it. And in these cases, the lack of access to an open basin is a lot less of an issue. But again, for most players, I really think the double basin is probably your best bet, but I'll talk more about why a little bit later. As for faucets, these are a bit less complicated, since I think by this point, most players have recognized that any kind of non-rigid faucet that allows you to freely manipulate the position of the faucet head is pretty much the best case scenario. However, making these types of choices mainly only applies to base owners or the players they've granted build permissions to, so if you don't find yourself in one of these positions, unfortunately you'll probably just have to work with what you've got. And while I can't exactly speak for faucets, luckily, I think most base builders have started to settle on the double basin for the standard loadout. So let's go ahead and talk about how to optimize your gameplay strategy to fit with one of these sinks. Now, the most important thing to consider when it comes to sink usage is your party dynamic. And while there are tons of different party types, in most cases they'll typically fall into one of 3 categories, with the first category being solo players, which I think are pretty self-explanatory. And then next up there are the carry groups, which usually take the form of the standard early family build, but it pretty much includes any party where a small number of higher level players essentially function as group leaders to a certain number of newer players that don't have full access to all the game's mechanics just yet, often providing them with the items and experience they need to complete the tutorial and early game leveling zones. And then last but not least, we have collectives, which are usually composed of any number of mid to late game players that are all pretty much independent, meaning that while they're all at different parts of the game in terms of progression, they all share the same base and its equipment as equal partners in maintaining it. Now, when it comes to sink usage, solo players probably have the easiest time settling into a consistent gameplay loop since they really only have to worry about their own items getting dirty and taking up sink space. As for carry groups, these can be a bit more chaotic depending on how many low-level players are in the group and depending on what stage of the early game each of these players are in. So these types of groups definitely require a lot more gameplay experience to operate efficiently, at least on the part of the higher level players. And for that reason, it's a bit harder to provide a cookie-cutter strategy for every situation out there, but what I can say is that it's generally recommended that early early on, the higher level players should do their best to encourage good gameplay habits by establishing a specific rule set for the lower level players to follow that helps the group more consistently and effectively tackle the dish problem. But it's important to remember that in most cases, each of the lower level players probably started playing at different times, so they will likely be progressing through the game's content at different rates. So in some cases, the plan may have to account for these differences in skill levels. One last note though, and this goes for pretty much any group with multiple players, depending on your situation, you may also want to consider utilizing additional pieces of equipment such as the dishwasher, which are fantastic machines capable of washing large quantities of dishes all at once, though they usually take a bit longer to do so. However, the trade-off is that these dishes are washed passively, meaning all players involved only need to expend the amount of energy needed to load the machine and start the cycle, and then they're free to perform other tasks in the meantime. And again, while carry groups definitely require the most advanced approaches to operate efficiently within a base, the group that I would say probably tends to have the most issues with these parts of the game are the collectives. In most cases, each member of a collective will mutually agree that they are individually responsible for their sanctioned areas of the base and for any inconvenience they introduce into the common areas that everyone share. However, it's this latter part of the agreement that a lot of low-ranking players don't always follow. And this is usually because it's quite common for these types of players to fall into the patterns of a solo player, and this usually ends up with them not realizing that their gameplay loop is negatively affecting the loop and morale stat of the other members of the collective. And when it comes to the sink, this often takes the form of leaving their dirty dishes in the basins for long periods of time while they pursue other objectives, which not only waste sink space, making it harder to wash larger tools and items, but as more and more dishes are stacked on top of each other, they'll eventually cut off access to the basins entirely, meaning players completely lose access to the garbage disposal and also lose out on the ability to use items such as strainers. Additionally, this issue can also severely limit access to the faucet, which is especially detrimental to groups forced into using rigid faucets, which often have a much more limited range of motion, meaning that items like pitchers and pots can no longer be filled with water for drinking or cooking. Now, of course, players do still have to work around the outside organizations they're aligned with, so there are some genuine excuses to leave things dirty for at least small periods of time, but it's generally considered common courtesy for them to clean their dishes once they return back to the base in order to avoid a potential pileup issue. And this is actually one of the primary reasons why the double basin sink has been so dominant in the sink meta, especially among high-ranking collective players. Because in these groups, whenever a player has to leave for a certain organizational responsibility before they're able to clean their dishes, rather than placing those items into one of the two basins at random, instead they will consciously choose to temporarily place all dirty items into whichever basin does not have the garbage disposal attached to it, purposefully leaving that side completely open at all times so their group members always have access to an empty basin for washing, straining, water access, or anything else they might need the sink for. And, if I'm being honest, I think some variation of this strategy actually has some of the most potential for optimizing sink gameplay regardless of group dynamic, as it essentially minimizes the downside of group-centric playstyles, with each player taking responsibility for their own dishes while maximizing the group's ability to optimally use the sink regardless of what they need it for. So no matter what type of group you're in, if you're looking to rank up your kitchen sink score, I highly recommend utilizing this strategy. I also recommend pairing it with the sponge tech of actually squeezing out any excess soap and water from your group's sponge item after every successful washing phase, which essentially allows the sponge to dry faster, which drastically reduces the chance for it to start smelling and increases the longevity of the sponge and the overall health of your party members by minimizing the opportunity for bacterial growth. But I think that pretty much covers it. Of course, you can always continue to optimize your sink gameplay with the addition of utility upgrades, and a surprising amount of these are actually available to players without building permissions, but at the end of the day, the purpose of this video was more so to teach you about the fundamentals of the sink meta so that you can better understand how to make the best decisions for your specific build and group dynamic.